A beggar girl finds an injured millionaire, but as she tries to help, a black car pulls up behind her and something terrible happens. Watch till the end. You won't regret it. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The scream cut through the frigid winter air like a razor, echoing through the narrow streets of Trenton's working-class district. 4-year-old Lily pressed her face against the fogged-up window of the shack, watching the dark clouds gathering over the clapboard houses and weathered roofs. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity that made her little heart race with fear. Across the unpaved street, inside a peeling blue house with barred windows, the harsh voice of her Aunt Carol echoed again, followed by the muffled sound of something heavy hitting the wall. Lily shrank into the corner of the tiny room, clutching the rag doll her mom had made before going to the hospital and never coming back. "Grandma Rose," the girl murmured to herself, repeating the name of her grandmother, who had left early to sell corncakes at the train station and hadn't returned yet. The house was cold and silent, with only the sound of the rain starting to drum on the leaky tin roof. Across town, in the penthouse of a modern building in Trenton's business district, Theodore Albright adjusted his tie in front of the mirror while mentally reviewing the numbers for the board meeting that would happen in an hour. At 52, the businessman had built an empire in the corn syrup processing sector, controlling 3 factories that employed over 1,000 people in the region. His routine was meticulous: wake up at 5 in the morning, review financial reports during coffee, and be in the office before any employee arrived. But that Tuesday, something was different. The numbers weren't adding up as they should, and Vince Drummond, his majority partner, had cancelled the meeting without convincing explanations. Theodore ran a hand through his graying hair, a habit he'd developed when he was worried, and looked out the panoramic window that offered a view of the entire city. Down below, people as small as ants scurried to take cover from the rain that was beginning to fall. Rose Martin, 73, pushed her corn cake cart through the wet streets, trying to sell the last of her treats before the rain ruined everything. Her wrinkled hands trembled not only from the cold, but from the constant worry about the granddaughter she had left alone at home. Since her daughter Helen had passed 5 years ago, leaving little Lily in her care, each day was a struggle to secure the bare necessities to survive. The pension she received barely covered the rent of the 2-room shack in Hope Village, a neighborhood that ironically didn't offer much hope for its residents. The thin walls allowed you to hear everything that happened in the neighboring houses, and lately the screams from the house next door were becoming more frequent and violent. Lily must be scared, Rose thought, quickening her pace despite legs that ached more and more. At 73, carrying the weight of the cart and walking miles a day was taking its toll, but there was no alternative. The girl depended on her, and she wouldn't fail her as she had failed her own daughter. Back at the shack, Lily had hidden under the kitchen table when the screams from the house next door intensified. Through the cracks in the wooden wall, she could see shadows moving violently, and the voice of a child crying echoed in her small chest. It was a girl like her, she was sure, but she had never been able to see her properly. The rain was now falling hard, creating puddles of mud on the unpaved street and making the roof of the shack drip in several places. Lily positioned buckets under the larger leaks, a task she had learned out of necessity. Rose always said she was a smart and brave girl, but at that moment, Lily felt only small and scared. The sound of heavy footsteps on the porch made her heart leap. They weren't Rose's shuffling steps, but something faster, more urgent. Lily ran to the window and saw a tall man, wearing a dark suit completely soaked, staggering towards the door. There was blood on his forehead, and he was constantly looking over his shoulder as if he were running from something. When the man knocked on the door hard, Lily hesitated. Rose always said not to open to strangers. But there was something in that man's eyes that didn't seem threatening. It was fear, a deep fear that she recognized because she felt the same when the screams from the house next door began. "Please," said the man's voice through the thin wooden door. "I need help." Lily looked one more time through the crack in the window and saw a black car slowly driving down the street, with the headlights on even though it was still late afternoon. The man also saw the car and quickly crouched down, pressing himself against the wall of the shack. It was then that the 4-year-old girl made a decision that would change everything. Lily turned the rusty doorknob with both little hands and opened the door just a crack, enough for the bloodied man to squeeze into the shack. Theodore Albright, one of the most powerful businessmen in the region, now found himself crouching on the cement floor of a 2-room house, trembling as much from the cold as from the fear that ran through his veins. "Thank you," he murmured, observing those big, curious eyes that stared at him without judgment. The girl quickly closed the door and ran to the window, peering through the torn curtain. The black car had stopped right in front of the house next door, and 2 men in suits got out, walking slowly down the muddy street. "Are they looking for you?" Lily asked with the naturalness typical of children, as if injured men appeared at her house every day. Theodore nodded, impressed by the girl's calmness in the face of the situation. He had spent decades leading meetings with dozens of people, but he had never felt as vulnerable as he did at that moment. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice low while wiping the blood that ran from a deep cut on his forehead. "Lily. And Grandma Rose isn't home," she replied, taking a clean dishcloth and offering it to him. "She said I can't open the door to strangers, but you looked like you needed help." Theodore took the cloth and pressed it against the wound, watching that small child who had risked her own safety to help a stranger. There was something in the purity of that gesture that touched him in a way he couldn't explain. It had been years since he had received kindness without ulterior motives. The sound of heavy footsteps outside made both freeze. The men from the black car were knocking door to door, and their harsh voices could be heard even through the thin walls of the shack. Lily instinctively moved closer to Theodore, and he gently pulled her away from the window. "We just want to ask some questions about an injured man," one of the voices said. "Someone may have seen him around here." Theodore recognized the voice of Carl, one of the goons that Vince kept on his payroll to solve problems. His mind raced, trying to understand how they had gotten to that neighborhood so quickly. He had left the factory through the back exit, taken a taxi to downtown, and then walked miles to reach the outskirts. How did they know where to look? The answer came like a punch to the stomach. Someone was tracking his movements. Vince not only wanted to get rid of him, but had planned everything meticulously. The discrepancies in the financial reports, the cancellation of the meeting, and now this coordinated pursuit. It was all part of a larger plan. Lily watched Theodore's face change, seeing the fear give way to a bitter understanding. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew how to recognize when someone was in real danger. It was the same expression she saw in the mirror when the screams from the house next door got too loud. "Are they bad men?" she whispered, placing her little hand over Theodore's trembling hand. "Very bad," he replied, surprised by his own honesty. He had never admitted fear to anyone, much less to a 4-year-old child. The footsteps approached the door of the shack, and Theodore's heart beat so hard that he was sure the men could hear it. Lily, with an impressive maturity for her age, gestured for him to be quiet and went to the door. "Who is it?" she asked in a childish voice, pretending to have just woken up. "Police," the harsh voice lied. "We're looking for a dangerous man who may be injured. Have you seen anyone like that around here?" "I haven't seen anyone. Grandma left for work and I was sleeping," Lily replied, her voice sounding perfectly convincing. Theodore watched her with growing admiration. That little girl was protecting a stranger with the skill of someone much older. "Where are your parents, little girl?" "Mom's gone, and I never saw my dad. I only have Grandma Rose." There was a pause on the other side of the door, and Theodore could hear the men talking in whispers. Finally, the footsteps moved away, but he knew they hadn't given up. They would just move on to the next house and eventually come back. When the sound of the black car faded away down the unpaved street, Lily turned to Theodore with a serious expression that contrasted with her delicate appearance. "They'll be back," she said with absolute certainty. "Men like that always come back." The sentence hit Theodore like a painful revelation. How could a 4-year-old child have so much awareness about the persistence of evil? What kind of life had she lived to develop such precocious wisdom? Meanwhile, across town, Vince Drummond walked through the corridors of the main factory with a satisfied smile on his lips. His plans were unfolding perfectly. In a few hours, Theodore would be just an unhappy memory, and he would have total control over an empire worth tens of millions. Vince stopped in front of the window of his office, watching the workers carrying bags of sugar in the light rain. Soon, all of that would be exclusively his. The 3 factories, the land, the contracts, and especially the secret project that Theodore had been developing with so much care, a project that Vince intended to use for his own profitable ends. Back at the shack in Hope Village, Rose finally arrived home, pushing her empty cart through the relentless rain. She was exhausted and worried because she hadn't been able to sell even half of the corn cakes because of the bad weather. That meant that dinner would be even scarcer than usual. As she approached home, she noticed that the light was on, and there were low voices coming from inside. Her heart raced. Lily was alone and never turned on the lights before she arrived, to save energy. Rose quickened her pace, not imagining that she was about to discover that her granddaughter had made a decision that would put all of their lives in mortal danger. Rose stopped in front of the door of the shack, listening attentively to the voices coming from inside. One of them was definitely not Lily's. With her heart beating fast, she turned the doorknob slowly and entered, encountering a scene she had never imagined finding. Her 4-year-old granddaughter was sitting on the floor next to a middle-aged man, well-dressed but clearly injured, offering him a glass of sugar water. "Grandma!" exclaimed Lily, running to hug Rose's wet legs. "This is Mr. Theodore. He was hurt, and some bad men were after him." Theodore got up quickly, holding out his hands in a sign of peace. "Ma'am, I can explain. I don't want to cause problems for you. Your granddaughter saved my life." Rose watched the man carefully. Despite the wound on his forehead and the dirty clothes, it was evident that he didn't belong in that neighborhood. The suit, even crumpled, was of good quality, and his hands showed no signs of manual labor. But there was something in his eyes, a deep pain that she recognized, that made her hesitate before throwing him out. "What bad men?" she asked, still keeping Lily behind her. "2 men in black suits came looking for him," Lily explained seriously. "I said I hadn't seen anyone, and they left, but they'll be back, Grandma. Men like that always come back." The girl's observation chilled Rose's blood. How did her granddaughter know so much about dangerous men? The answer was in the house next door, in the screams that echoed every night, in the violence that seeped through the thin walls like a slow poison. Theodore sensed the tension in the air and decided to be direct. "Mrs. Martin, I presume. My name is Theodore Albright. I'm a businessman in the region, and I'm being pursued by people who want to harm me. Your granddaughter offered me shelter when I needed it most." "Albright. And from the factories?" Rose asked, recognizing the last name. Even living on the outskirts, she knew who the big employers in the region were. "Yes, and I understand if you want me to leave immediately. I don't want to expose you to danger." Rose looked at Lily, who was watching the conversation attentively, and then at the injured man that her granddaughter had decided to help. There was something about the situation that reminded her of her own youth, when she worked as a nurse in a small clinic and learned to recognize when someone was truly in danger. "The men who are after you, are they dangerous?" she asked directly. "Very, and they won't hesitate to hurt anyone who is helping me." Theodore's brutal honesty touched Rose more than any plea could have done. She made a decision that would change the course of their lives. "You can stay tonight," she said, surprising even Lily. "But tomorrow we need to find another place for you to hide." Meanwhile, at Vince Drummond's mansion in the upscale neighborhood of the city, the businessman received a phone call that irritated him deeply. His men had lost Theodore's trail in the outskirts, and now he had simply disappeared. "How could they disappeared?" Vince screamed into the phone, pacing nervously through the living room decorated with expensive furniture and artwork. "He's injured and on foot. How could he vanish?" "Boss, we searched the whole neighborhood. Nobody saw anything," Carl replied from the other end of the line. "Maybe he managed to get out of the area before we got there." "Theodore's smart, but he's not a magician. He's hiding somewhere around there. I want you to go back first thing in the morning and turn every shack upside down if necessary." Vince slammed the phone down, smashing the device against the wall. His plans depended on eliminating Theodore before he discovered the full extent of his betrayal. There was much more at stake than just the factories. Back at the shack in Hope Village, Rose was preparing a thin soup with the few ingredients she had, while Lily helped Theodore properly clean the wound on his forehead. The girl had found some old bandages that Rose kept in a cookie tin, leftovers from the time she worked at the clinic. "Grandma used to be a nurse," Lily explained proudly, while Theodore watched the elderly woman's experienced hands tending to his wound. "She knows how to take care of hurts." "I was a nurse for many years," Rose confirmed, applying a homemade disinfectant that made Theodore wince in pain. "I worked at the city clinic and also on some farms in the area." "What years were those?" Theodore asked, trying to distract himself from the pain. "Between 1970 and 1990, more or less. Then I got married and stopped working to take care of my family." Something in Rose's answer sparked a distant memory in Theodore's mind, but he couldn't quite place it. There was something familiar in her voice, in the gentle way she took care of his wound. During the silent dinner, the soup served in chipped bowls was the only food available. Theodore observed the relationship between grandmother and granddaughter. Lily ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it were a banquet, while Rose barely touched her own portion, clearly saving as much as possible for the girl. "May I ask where Lily's parents are?" Theodore questioned carefully. Rose's face darkened. "Her mother, my daughter Helen, passed away when Lily was 6 months old. She was very sick, very sad. She never recovered after childbirth." "And the father?" "He was never around. Helen never wanted to talk about him." Theodore noticed that Lily listened to everything in silence, as if she already knew this story by heart. Again, he was impressed by the girl's precocious maturity. When it was time to sleep, Rose offered Theodore the old sofa in the living room, while she and Lily would sleep in the only bedroom in the shack. Before they went to bed, Lily approached him with her rag doll. "Mr. Theodore, do you have family waiting for you at home?" The simple question hit Theodore like a blow to the chest. "I don't have family, Lily. Lost them all when I was young." "Just like me," she said naturally. "But now we have Grandma. And today, you do too." The girl's words touched something deep in Theodore's heart. It had been decades since anyone had included him in a family, even symbolically. But while everyone tried to sleep that cold night, none of them knew that Vince had already discovered where Theodore was hiding. One of the neighbors had noticed the strange activity at Rose's shack, and seduced by the promise of a generous reward, had called the number that Vince had spread throughout the town. At dawn, armed men would surround the small house, putting 3 innocent lives in mortal danger. The first ray of sunlight had barely appeared on the horizon when Lily woke up to the sound of engines approaching on the unpaved street. She ran to the window and saw 3 black cars parking in strategic locations around the shack, blocking all possible exits. Her small heart leaped when she recognized 2 of the men who had been there the day before. "Grandma, Mr. Theodore," she whispered urgently, running to wake the adults. "The bad men are back, and they brought more people." Theodore awoke instantly, the survival instinct speaking louder than fatigue. Through the crack in the curtain, he counted at least 6 men positioning themselves around the house. Vince wasn't kidding around. He had sent a real army to capture him. Rose got up quickly, picking Lily up in her arms and trying to think of a solution. The shack had no back exit, only a small bathroom window that overlooked the backyard of the house next door. "Is there any way to get out without being seen?" Theodore asked in despair. "The house next door has a hole in the fence," Lily said suddenly. "I saw it when I was playing. The girl who lives there uses it to escape when her dad gets mad." It was the first time she had mentioned knowing the child from the house next door, from where the nightly screams came. Rose looked at her in surprise, but there was no time for questions. "Theodore, you're going to have to get out that way," Rose said, pointing to the small bathroom window. "Lily will show you the way." "I'm not going to leave you here," he protested. "If they find out you helped me—" "They already know," Rose interrupted bitterly. "Otherwise they wouldn't be here so early. Someone turned us in." At that moment, an amplified voice echoed from outside. "Theodore Albright, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up and no one will get hurt." Lily began to tremble, remembering the moments of terror she experienced when she heard screams coming from the house next door. But this time, the danger was in her own house. Theodore made a quick decision. He kissed Lily on the forehead and shook Rose's hand. "Thank you for everything. I will never forget your kindness." He went to the bathroom window, which was barely large enough for a man of his size to pass through. As he struggled to get out, he heard the sound of kicks on the front door. "Open this door or we'll break it down," another voice shouted. Rose held Lily firmly and walked to the door. There was no point in resisting. They would end up coming in anyway. When she opened the door, 6 armed men stormed into the shack, rummaging through every corner in search of Theodore. Carl, the leader of the group, grabbed Rose by the arm with unnecessary force. "Where is he, old woman?" "I don't know who you're talking about," Rose lied, even knowing that they wouldn't believe her. "Don't mess with me. We know he spent the night here." Lily, still in her grandmother's arms, watched everything with wide eyes of terror. It was like the nightmares she had about the screams from the house next door, but this time it was happening to them. "Please," Rose pleaded, "not in front of the child." Carl looked at Lily, and his face hardened even more. "Where's the man you hid last night?" "He left early this morning," Lily said suddenly, her voice small but firm. "He said he didn't want to bring trouble for us." The man bent down to get to the girl's height, his strong cigarette breath making her shrink back. "Are you sure about that, little one?" Lily nodded, maintaining eye contact even with fear running through her veins. She had learned that lying convincingly was sometimes the only form of protection a child had. Meanwhile, Theodore had managed to get through the window and was crawling through the muddy backyard of the house next door. It was then that he saw something that horrified him. A girl of about 6 years old was hiding behind a tree, with purple marks on her arms and a swollen eye. The child saw him and immediately flinched, fearing more violence. Theodore approached slowly, whispering reassuring words. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently. "Do you know Lily from next door?" The girl nodded timidly. "I'm her friend. She gives me food sometimes, when my dad drinks too much." Theodore's heart broke. 2 small children, living in situations of extreme vulnerability, finding ways to support each other. "What's your name?" "Carla." "Carla, I need your help. Bad men are in Lily's house, and I need to find a way to get to the street without being seen." The girl pointed to a part of the fence that was completely fallen down. "You can get to the back street that way. My dad never fixed it because he uses it to run away when the police come." Theodore thanked her and was about to leave when he heard a scream coming from Rose's shack. It was Lily's voice, crying in fear. All his instincts screamed for him to go back and protect the girl who had risked everything to save him. But he knew that if he was captured, he could do nothing to help them. The only chance they had was for him to escape and find a way to call for help. With a broken heart, He passed through the broken fence and ran down the back street, promising himself that he would return to save Lily and Rose, no matter the cost. Back at the shack, Carl was losing patience. His men had searched every corner and found no sign of Theodore. "You're lying," he shouted, approaching Rose menacingly. "He can't have just disappeared." It was then that he noticed the open bathroom window and understood how Theodore had escaped. His fury exploded, and he turned to the two defenseless women. "You're going to pay for this," he growled, picking up the phone to call Vince. Lily pressed herself against Rose, feeling that their lives had changed forever at that moment. Even at just 4 years old, she knew that men like those didn't forget or forgive betrayals. And on the other end of the line, Vince Drummond was preparing a revenge that would be much more cruel than they could imagine. 3 days had passed since the invasion, and life at Rose's shack had become a silent hell. Vince's men hadn't returned, but their presence could still be felt like a menacing shadow. Neighbors who previously greeted Rose on the street now looked away, afraid to associate with someone who had defied dangerous men. Lily hadn't spoken a word since the incident. She spent her days sitting in the corner of the room, hugging her rag doll, watching the street through the crack in the curtain. Rose tried to comfort her with stories and songs, but the girl remained mute, lost in her own fears. "My little flower," Rose whispered, stroking her granddaughter's hair. "You need to eat something. I made a tasty soup for you." But Lily just shook her head, refusing any food. The trauma had stolen not only her voice, but also her appetite, leaving her even thinner and more fragile. Meanwhile, across town, Theodore was hiding in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Trenton. He had managed to get there, walking through the less-traveled streets, always looking over his shoulder. The wound on his forehead was getting infected, and he had no resources to seek medical help without exposing himself. During these 3 days, he couldn't stop thinking about Lily and Rose. The image of the brave girl who had lied to protect him haunted his thoughts. He knew that his escape had put the two in danger, and the guilt consumed him more than the physical pain. On Thursday morning, Rose made a desperate decision. Lily was visibly getting worse. She didn't talk, barely ate, and had started having nightmares that made her wake up screaming in the middle of the night. The elderly woman knew she needed to seek help, even risking her own safety. She left Lily in the care of Mrs. Davis, a trusted neighbor who lived 3 houses down, and set out towards the city center. Her first stop was at the main church in Trenton, where she hoped to find Father Michael, a man known for helping families in need. The church was almost empty when Rose entered, her old sandals echoing on the cold marble floor. Father Michael, a 58-year-old man with grey hair and kind eyes, was organizing the altar for the evening mass. "Father," Rose called in a trembling voice, "I need to speak with you." The priest turned and immediately noticed the despair on the woman's face. "Of course, my daughter. Let's talk in the confessional." Rose reported everything that had happened, from the arrival of the wounded Theodore to the invasion by the armed men. Father Michael listened in silence, his face growing more and more concerned. "And your granddaughter, how is she coping with all of this?" he asked. "She doesn't talk anymore, Father. She doesn't eat right. She's withering away in front of me, and I don't know what to do." The priest reflected for a few moments before responding. "Rose, I recognize the name Theodore Albright. He has made several donations to charities in the region. He always seemed like a man of integrity." "So you believe his story?" "I do, yes. And I also know that Vince Drummond has a questionable reputation. There have been rumors about his business practices for years." Father Michael got up, pacing nervously around the small space of the confessional. "There is something I can do to help you, but it's risky." Rose leaned forward, clinging to any hope. "Whatever it takes, Father. I have contacts in the district attorney's office. I can report Vince discreetly, but you will need protection until some action is taken." At that very moment, across town, Vince was receiving disturbing information in his luxurious office. One of his informants had discovered that Rose had sought help at the church, and it infuriated him. "That old woman is becoming a problem," he muttered to Carl, who was sitting across the mahogany desk. "And the girl too. They know too much." "What do you want us to do?" Carl asked, toying with a coin between his fingers. Vince got up and walked to the window that overlooked the city. "Nothing direct. We can't attract attention. But there are other ways to silence inconvenient people." He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Hello, social services? I would like to make an anonymous report about a child at risk." Rose was returning home when she noticed an official car parked in front of the shack. Her heart leaped as she saw two women in suits talking to Mrs. Davis at the door. "Mrs. Rose Martin?" asked one of them as she saw her approaching. "I'm social worker Sarah Johnson. We received a report about neglect involving child neglect concerning your granddaughter." "What do you mean, neglect?" Rose asked, incredulous. "The report says that the child has been exposed to violent situations and is not receiving adequate care. We need to assess the situation." Rose realized immediately that this was Vince's doing. A subtle but devastating revenge. If they took Lily, she would lose the only family she had left. "Can I see my granddaughter first?" she asked, trying to stay calm. "Of course. But it's important to know that temporary foster care for the child may be necessary while we investigate." When they entered the shack, they found Lily exactly where Rose had left her, sitting in the corner, mute and still. The social worker exchanged a meaningful glance with her colleague. "How long has she been like this?" Sarah Johnson asked. "Since Tuesday. She witnessed something very traumatic," Rose explained, choosing her words carefully. "And what kind of traumatic situation would that be?" Rose hesitated. If she told about the invasion, she would confirm that she was involved in something dangerous. If she lied, she wouldn't be able to explain Lily's condition. It was then that the girl herself made a decision that surprised everyone. She stood up slowly, walked to the social worker, and for the first time in 3 days, opened her mouth to speak. "Bad men came here. They wanted to hurt my friend who was hurt. Grandma didn't do anything wrong." The words came out in a whisper, but they were enough for Sarah Johnson to understand that there was much more to that story than the report suggested. "What men, honey?" she asked gently, crouching down to Lily's height. "The same ones who hurt Carla from next door." Lily's answer revealed that she knew much more about the violence in the neighborhood than any 4-year-old should know. And that would completely change the course of the investigation. Lily's mention of Carla completely transformed the atmosphere in the shack. Sarah Johnson, the social worker, immediately directed her attention to the house next door, where for months there had been reports of domestic violence that were never properly investigated. "Lily, can you tell me about Carla?" she asked gently, sitting on the floor to be at the girl's height. "She's my friend. Her dad drinks that stinky stuff and then gets mad. He hurts her and her mom. I give her food when she's hungry." Rose watched her granddaughter speak for the first time in days, mixing relief with worry. Lily was revealing information that could put them in even more danger, but perhaps it was the only way to prove that they weren't the ones who were neglecting. "And you saw the men who were here? Can you describe them to me?" Lily nodded gravely. "There were 6. 2 came before, in the black car. Then they came back with 4 more. They wanted to hurt Mr. Theodore, but he was already gone." The social worker noted everything in her notebook, realizing that the original report did not correspond to the reality she was discovering. That child was not being neglected. She was being protected by a dedicated grandmother in an extremely hostile environment. "Rose," Sarah Johnson said, closing the notebook, "I need to investigate the situation in the house next door first, but I want you to know that this report against you seems to have been made with bad intentions." At that moment, piercing screams echoed from the house next door, followed by the sound of something breaking. Lily automatically shrank against Rose, demonstrating that those sounds were a terrifying constant in her life. "Does that happen often?" the social worker asked. "Almost every day," Rose replied. "I've tried to report it several times, but they never followed up." Sarah Johnson went to the house next door, leaving her colleague with Rose and Lily. When she knocked on the door, a tall and visibly intoxicated man answered, exuding a strong odor of alcohol and aggressiveness. "What do you want?" he asked in a hostile manner. "I'm from social services. We are investigating reports of domestic violence in this residence." "I don't know what you're talking about. Nothing like that happens here." But at that moment, Carla, the 6-year-old girl, appeared behind her father with her face marked by recent bruises. Upon seeing the social worker, her eyes filled with desperate hope. "Dad, can I play outside?" she asked timidly. "Go back to your room!" the man shouted, pushing the girl violently. Sarah Johnson had seen enough. "Sir, I'm going to need to come in to assess the child's conditions. You're not coming into anywhere. Get off my property." The situation was escalating when a police car arrived, called by the social worker herself as a precaution. The presence of the officers immediately changed the violent man's posture. Meanwhile, miles away, Theodore had managed to contact a former trusted employee through a public phone. Mark, who had worked in the factory's accounting department for 15 years, agreed to meet with him in secret to discuss the situation. The meeting took place in a small diner on the outskirts of town, where Mark brought devastating information about what was happening at the companies. "Theodore, the situation is worse than you imagine," Mark said nervously, constantly looking around. "Vince isn't just trying to keep your share. He's using the factories to launder money from illegal operations." "What kind of operations?" "Loan sharking, mostly. He lends money at exorbitant interest rates to small farmers, and when they can't pay, he forces the sale of the land for negligible amounts." Theodore felt his stomach churn. "How long has this been happening?" "At least 2 years. He used your absence at board meetings to approve operations you would never know about. And there's more. He found out about your orphanage project." Theodore's heart stopped. The orphanage was his most personal project, secretly funded with his own resources in memory of his deceased sister. "How did he find out?" "I don't know, but he's planning to use the land for something else. He mentioned something about selling it to a mining company." The revelation hit Theodore like a physical blow. Vince wasn't just destroying his company, he was defiling his sister's memory. Back in the Hope Village neighborhood, the situation at the house next door had been temporarily resolved with the removal of little Carla and her mother to a safe shelter. The violent father was detained, and finally the neighborhood experienced a silence it hadn't known for months. Lily watched from the window as they took her friend Carla to the social services car. "Is Carla going to be okay now?" she asked Rose. "Yes, my little flower. She's going to a place where no one will hurt her." "Like Mr. Theodore? Did he go to a safe place too?" Lily's innocent question touched a deep wound in Rose's heart. She didn't know if Theodore was safe, and the worry for the man her granddaughter had saved grew with each passing day. Sarah Johnson returned to the shack with a softer expression. "Rose, I apologize for the investigation. It's clear that the report against you was malicious. Lily is being very well cared for. And now, what's going to happen to us? You continue with your lives normally, but I want you to know that if there is any kind of threat or intimidation, you can contact me directly." She handed over a card with her personal phone number, something she rarely did. There was something about that family that touched her deeply, the courage of an elderly grandmother protecting her granddaughter and the precocious wisdom of a child who had faced situations that would traumatize many adults. That night, for the first time in days, Lily managed to sleep without nightmares. The removal of the violent family from the house next door had brought a peace she hadn't known since she was very little. But in the middle of the night, she woke up to a different sound, someone knocking gently on the door. Rose got up startled, fearing that Vince's men had returned. But when she peeked through the crack in the curtain, she saw a familiar figure that made her sigh with relief and worry at the same time. It was Theodore, but he wasn't alone. Behind him was a younger man she didn't recognize, and both seemed extremely tense. "Rose," Theodore whispered when she opened the door, "I need your help one more time. I've discovered something terrible about Vince, and there's no one else I can trust." Rose hesitated for only a moment before opening the door completely, allowing Theodore and the unknown man to enter quickly. Lily had woken up with the voices and ran to hug Theodore, demonstrating genuine joy at seeing him again. "Mr. Theodore, you're okay!" she exclaimed, clinging to his legs as if she wanted to make sure he was real. "I am, brave little one," he replied, stroking the girl's hair. "And I came to thank you for saving me." The man accompanying Theodore introduced himself as Mark Santos, an accountant at the factories for 15 years. He was a thin man of approximately 40 years, with thick glasses and a constantly worried expression. "Mrs. Martin," Theodore said, sitting down in the old kitchen chair, "Mark brought information that proves Vince is involved in very serious crimes. But we also discovered that the situation is even worse than we imagined." Rose served weak coffee to the two men, while Lily snuggled next to Theodore, as if his presence made her feel safe again. "Vince has been using the factories to launder dirty money for at least 2 years, Mark explained nervously. He set up a scheme of illegal loans to small farmers. When they can't pay, he forces the sale of the properties for values well below market. And the worst thing," Theodore continued with a voice full of pain, "is that he found out about the orphanage I'm building in memory of my sister. He wants to sell the land to a mining company that will completely devastate the area." Rose was silent, processing the gravity of the situation. "But if you have evidence, why don't you go to the police?" Mark and Theodore exchanged a meaningful glance. "Because Vince has contacts within the local police," Mark revealed. "At least 3 detectives receive bribes from him regularly." "So you're completely alone," Rose murmured. "Not completely," Theodore said, looking at Lily. "This girl taught me that sometimes the most unlikely people can save us. And I have a plan, but I need your help." At that moment, Vince Drummond was in his office, receiving a frustrating report from Carl. His men had searched the entire city and found no sign of Theodore. "How could he just disappear?" Vince shouted, throwing papers on the floor. "A wounded man, without resources, without contacts." "Boss, maybe he managed to leave the city," Carl suggested. "Impossible. Theodore is too stubborn to run." "He's somewhere nearby, planning something." Vince walked to the window, watching the city lights. "And those 2 women, they know where he is. Do you want us to go back there?" "No. We've already attracted too much attention with the first invasion. I need a more subtle approach." Vince picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Hello, Detective Riley. It's Vince Drummond. I need a personal favor." Back at the shack, Theodore was explaining his plan to Rose and Mark. "I need concrete evidence of Vince's crimes. Documents, recordings, anything that proves his illegal activities." "I have access to the accounting files," Mark said, "but everything is in the factory's main office. It would be too risky." "And if we get that evidence, what will we do with it?" Rose asked. "I'm going to look for a prosecutor in New York City who has no ties to Vince. Someone outside his influence." Lily, who was listening to everything in silence, suddenly asked a question that surprised the adults. "Mr. Theodore, does the bad man know where you are?" "No, little one. Why do you ask?" "Because when the bad men were here, one of them talked on the phone about a person who knew a lot of things. He said they were going to find that person and make them tell everything." Lily's words chilled Mark's blood. "Theodore, they may be talking about me. If they find out I helped you—" "Calm down," Theodore said, trying to remain calm despite his own fear. "Let's think of a way to get the evidence without putting you at risk." It was then that Rose had an unexpected idea. "What if I went to the factory?" Everyone turned to her, surprised. "I'm an elderly woman, apparently harmless. I can make up some excuse to be there. Maybe looking for a job as a cleaning lady or something. Absolutely not, Theodore protested. It's too dangerous. More dangerous than staying here waiting for Vince to find out you're hiding in my house, Rose retorted firmly. Her logic was irrefutable. Standing still was not an option, and Rose would really be the last person Vince would suspect. Grandma, I want to go with you, Lily said suddenly. No way, my little flower. But if you go alone, it'll look weird. If you take a little granddaughter with you, no one will suspect anything. Again, Lily's precocious wisdom impressed the adults. A grandmother looking for a job with her granddaughter in tow would be a completely normal and harmless scene. Theodore crouched down in front of Lily, looking seriously into her eyes. Are you sure you want to do this? It can be very dangerous. Yes, the bad man wants to hurt you, and you're our friend. Friends protect each other. The simplicity and courage of the girl touched Theodore deeply. He remembered his sister at the same age, always willing to help even when she didn't fully understand the risks. Okay, he said finally, but with great care, and only if Mark can create a distraction that keeps Vince away from the office. Mark nodded nervously. I can invent an urgent problem at one of the factories. That would force him to leave the main office for at least 2 hours. The plan was taking shape, but everyone knew they were walking a tightrope. One mistake, and the consequences would be devastating not only for them, but especially for an innocent 4-year-old girl who had decided to fight against forces much greater than her. That night, as they planned every detail of the risky operation, none of them knew that Vince had already set in motion a plan of his own that would involve a revelation about Rose's past. A revelation that would forever change the way they all saw that story. Destiny was about to reveal connections that no one had imagined, and the price of the truth would be much higher than any of them were prepared to pay. The next morning brought a fine rain that made the air even colder. Rose put on her best clothes, a simple but clean dress, and dressed Lily with special care, as if they were really going to make an important visit. The plan was simple. They would arrive at the factory as if Rose was looking for work, while Mark would create a fake emergency to distract Vince. Remember, Theodore said for the last time, if anything seems wrong, get out immediately. Your lives are worth much more than any evidence. Lily held Rose's hand tightly as they walked along the road that led to the industrial complex. The girl carried her rag doll, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary child, accompanying her grandmother. Grandma, I'm scared, she confessed quietly. I am too, honey. But sometimes we need to be brave to protect those we love. When they arrived at the factory gates, Rose took a deep breath and approached the security guard. Good morning. I came to ask if there are any openings for a cleaning lady. I'm a reliable person and I really need the work. The security guard, a middle-aged man with a prominent belly, looked at them indifferently. You'll have to talk to HR. It's in the main building, 2nd floor. Rose thanked him and headed towards the building, carefully observing the movement around her. There were workers working, trucks loading corn syrup, and the normal activity of a company in operation. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. On the 2nd floor, they found the Human Resources office, where a young receptionist greeted them. Do you have experience with industrial cleaning? I worked in hospitals and clinics for many years, Rose replied honestly. I know how to handle heavy cleaning and chemicals. Meanwhile, on the 3rd floor, Mark executed his part of the plan. He called Vince, pretending to be in a panic. Mr. Drummond, there's a serious problem at Factory 2. The distillation equipment is showing serious failures. If we don't fix it now, we can lose the entire week's production. Vince, always obsessed with profits, did not hesitate. I'm going there now. Gather the technical team. In 15 minutes, Vince was leaving the main building with 2 engineers, leaving the administrative office with minimal security. Rose received a form to fill out and was directed to a waiting room. Someone will come to talk to you in a few minutes, the receptionist said. It was at that moment that Lily, playing seemingly unconcerned with her doll, observed a man in a suit leaving an elevator carrying a folder of documents. It was the perfect moment. "Grandma, can I go to the bathroom?" she asked loud enough for the receptionist to hear. "Of course, honey. It's down the hall," indicated the receptionist. Rose got up to accompany her granddaughter, as any grandmother would. But on the way to the bathroom, they passed in front of Vince's office, which had the door ajar. Lily purposefully dropped her doll, which rolled into the room. "Oh, my doll!" she exclaimed, running after it. Rose followed her, and both found themselves inside Vince's luxurious office. The room was impressive, with expensive furniture and a panoramic view of the city, but they didn't have time to admire it. "Quick, Grandma," Lily whispered, pointing to the desk where there were piles of documents. Rose quickly grabbed the papers that seemed most important, photographing them with a simple cell phone that Theodore had lent her. Her hands trembled as she tried to capture as much information as possible. It was then that she heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. Her heart stopped. "Lily, we need to get out of here now," she whispered urgently. But the girl was examining something in the open drawer of the desk. "Grandma, look at this." Inside the drawer were old photographs, and one of them made Rose pale completely. It was a photo of herself, much younger, wearing a nurse's uniform, holding a wounded boy in her arms. "My God," she murmured, taking the photograph with trembling hands. The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer and closer. Rose quickly put the photo in her pocket and picked up Lily. Leaving the room, at the exact moment, an employee appeared at the end of the hallway. "Sorry," she said naturally. "My granddaughter dropped her doll, and it ended up in this room. I hope it's not a problem." The employee looked at them suspiciously, but the harmless appearance of an elderly grandmother with a small child reassured him. "It's not a problem, but it's better not to go into closed rooms." Of course. It won't happen again." They returned to the waiting room, where Rose filled out the form with hands still trembling. The receptionist informed them that they would be contacted in a few days, and they left the factory trying to maintain a normal appearance. Only when they were at a safe distance from the industrial complex did Rose allow her wobbly legs to finally give way. She sat on a rock on the side of the road, breathing heavily. "Did we do it, Grandma?" asked Lily. "We did, my brave one, but we discovered something much more important than evidence." Rose took the photograph from her pocket and observed it again. The image transported her back in time to a terrible night 22 years ago, when she still worked as a nurse in a private clinic on the outskirts of town. That night, a family had arrived desperate with a boy seriously injured in a fire. The parents and a younger sister had not survived, but the boy, despite his serious injuries, was still breathing. Rose had taken care of him for weeks, seeing him struggle between life and a very delicate situation. When he finally recovered, he was adopted by distant relatives, and she never heard from him again. The boy in the photograph was Theodore. She had saved Theodore's life years ago, and now fate had conspired for him to appear wounded at her door, for her granddaughter to protect him in the same way that she had protected him decades before. "Grandma, why are you crying?" asked Lily, worried. "I'm not sad, honey. I'm emotional because I discovered that sometimes the world makes sense in ways we can't understand." When they got home, Theodore and Mark were waiting anxiously. "Did you get anything?" Rose handed over the phone with the photos of the documents, but kept the old photograph. She wasn't ready to reveal that connection yet. First, she needed to understand why Vince had it in his drawer. Mark examined the photos on the phone, and his face turned pale. "Theodore, this is much worse than we imagined. These documents show that Vince isn't just laundering money. He's planning to purposefully bankrupt the factories after transferring all the assets to shell corporations." "What do you mean?" "He's going to declare bankruptcy, fire all the employees without paying severance, and then buy back the assets for negligible amounts through the shell corporations. Thousands of families will be unemployed, and he'll get everything. The revelation was devastating. Vince wasn't just destroying Theodore. He was about to ruin an entire region that depended economically on the factories. "We need to act quickly," Theodore said, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. But at that moment, Mark's phone rang. It was Vince, and his voice was full of fury. "Mark, where are you? The emergency at Factory 2 that you reported doesn't exist. Someone tricked me, and when I find out who it was—" The call was cut off, but the message was clear. Vince had discovered that he had been deceived, and now he was even more dangerous than before. Vince's call had changed everything. Mark was clearly in a panic, walking from one side to the other in the small shack while his mind processed the possible consequences of having been discovered. "He's going to find me," Mark murmured, running his hands through his hair. "Vince has people all over the city. If he finds out I was the one who created the fake emergency—" "Calm down," Theodore said, trying to keep control of the situation. "He's not sure of anything yet. It may have just been a suspicion." "You don't understand," replied Mark, his voice trembling. "Vince didn't survive in the business world by being naive. If he suspects me, he must already be investigating." Rose watched the discussion in silence, still processing the discovery of the photograph. Lily approached her, realizing that her grandmother was disturbed by something beyond the immediate situation. "Grandma, what's in that picture you kept?" asked the girl, with her sharp perception. Rose hesitated. Telling about the connection with Theodore could further complicate an already complex situation, but keeping that secret didn't seem right either. "It's a very old photo, honey. From when I was a nurse." Theodore interrupted his conversation with Mark when he heard the word nurse. "Mrs. Martin, did you say that you were a nurse?" "I was, yes, for many years until I got married." "During what period?" "Between 1970 and 1995. I worked mainly in private clinics and on some farms in the area." Something in Rose's answer sparked a vague memory in Theodore's mind. There was something familiar in her voice, in her careful gestures when treating his wound days ago. At that moment, the sound of cars approaching on the unpaved street made everyone freeze. Theodore ran to the window and saw 3 black vehicles positioning themselves around the shack, exactly as had happened days before. "They're back," he said somberly. This time, however, Vince had come personally. He got out of the central car with an expression of cold fury that made everyone's blood run cold. Carl and 5 other men spread out around the house, blocking any possibility of escape. "Theodore Albright," shouted Vince from the street, "I know you're in there, and this time there will be no escape." Rose picked up Lily, trying to protect her from what was to come. Mark was visibly terrified, muttering prayers quietly. "Come out now, or I'm going to go in there and hurt those innocent people you're using as a shield," continued Vince. It was then that Theodore made a decision that surprised everyone. He headed towards the door, clearly intending to surrender. "No," Rose said firmly, holding his arm. "If you go out, he'll kill us anyway. We are too many witnesses." "She's right," agreed Mark. "Vince can't leave anyone alive who knows about his crimes." Lily, who had remained quiet in Rose's arms, suddenly spoke. "Mr. Theodore, do you remember when you were little and someone saved you from a place burning?" The question hit Theodore like a lightning bolt. He turned to the girl, then to Rose, seeing for the first time the similarity between the elderly woman in front of him and a hazy memory of his childhood. "How do you know about that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Rose, realizing that there was no longer any way to postpone the revelation, took the photograph from her pocket. "Because I was the one who saved you, Theodore. I was the nurse who took care of you after the fire." The world stopped for Theodore. He took the photograph with trembling hands, immediately recognizing the wounded boy, himself at 10 years old. and the young woman holding him in her arms was, without a doubt, Rose. "My God," he whispered, you saved my life." "And now your granddaughter did the same thing," said Rose softly. "Fate brought us back to save each other." Outside, Vince was losing patience. "Last chance, Theodore, 5 seconds or we're invading." It was at that moment that Lily had an idea that demonstrated an impressive strategic intelligence for a 4-year-old child. "Grandma," she whispered, "the lady from social services left that card with her phone number. She said to call if there were any problems." Rose immediately remembered Sarah Johnson and took the card that was in the kitchen drawer. With trembling hands, she dialed the number on the old landline phone. "Sarah Johnson, it's Rose Martin. Remember the investigation at my shack? I need urgent help. There are armed men surrounding my house, threatening me and my granddaughter." The social worker, who was in her office, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. "Rose, stay on the line. I'm calling the police now." "But be careful who you call," Rose warned. "Some police officers may be involved with these men." Sarah Johnson understood the insinuation and decided to contact the state police directly, avoiding the local jurisdiction that could be compromised. Meanwhile, Vince had decided not to wait any longer. He signaled to his men, who began to approach the house. "Mark," called Vince loud enough to be heard inside the shack, "I know you're there too. You betrayed me, and there will be consequences." The accountant was practically in a state of shock, muttering about how his life had turned into a nightmare. It was then that Theodore made a surprising discovery when he looked more closely at the photograph. In the lower corner, there was a date and a stamp from the clinic. St. Rita's Clinic, August 15th, 1980. "Rose," he said suddenly, "do you remember other details about that night, about my family? I remember that you came from Hope Farm. The fire had completely destroyed the main house. Your parents and your little sister couldn't escape. And don't you find it strange that Vince has that photograph in his drawer?" The question made Rose stop breathing for a moment. Why would Vince have a picture of her with Theodore as a child? How had he gotten that image? "Unless," she began, a terrible suspicion forming in her mind. "Unless he knew about the fire all along," Theodore completed, reaching the same terrifying conclusion. Just then, they heard sirens in the distance. Social worker Sarah Johnson had gotten help, and the police were arriving. But Vince also heard the sounds and understood that he needed to act quickly. "Tear down the door," he yelled to his men. As the goons prepared to break in, Theodore looked at Rose with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "You saved me when I was a kid. Now it's my turn to protect you and Lily." "How?" Rose asked. Theodore observed the shack, noticing that there was a wall that led directly to the neighboring house, the same house from which Sarah had been removed days before, and that was now empty. "Mark," he said urgently, "help me break down this wall. If we can get into the next house, we can get out through the back without being seen." It was a race against time. Outside, Vince and his men prepared for the final assault while the sirens grew closer. And inside the shack, 4 people fought desperately for their lives, united by connections that fate had woven over decades. With desperate strength, Theodore and Mark began kicking the wall that separated the shack from the neighboring house. The old wooden structure gave way more easily than they expected, creating an opening through which they could pass. Rose held Lily firmly, whispering words of encouragement to keep the little girl calm. "Come on, quick!" Theodore urged, helping Rose and Lily through the opening first. Outside, the sound of kicks on the front door intensified. Vince had completely lost patience and ordered his men to invade immediately. When everyone had passed into the neighboring house, they found an environment devastated by years of hardship. Broken furniture, walls with holes, shattered glass on the floor. It was the scene of the tortured life that little Carla, neighbor, had lived until she was rescued. "This way," Lily indicated, showing she knew every corner of the house. Carla showed me the way to the backyard. The sirens were much closer now, and Vince knew he had little time. When his men finally broke down the door to Rose's shack, they found the house empty and the broken wall. "They fled to the house next door," Carl yelled. "I'll go after them." "No," Vince ordered. "The police are coming. We need to get out of here now." "But boss, they have evidence against us." Vince stared fixedly in the direction of the neighboring house, calculating his options. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Theodore may have escaped today, but he won't escape forever." Meanwhile, Theodore and the others had managed to exit through the back of the neighboring house, emerging onto a parallel street. Rose knew those alleys well and guided them along a path that would lead them to the main church in Trenton without passing through the main streets. "Father Michael will help us," she said, breathing heavily from the effort of the escape. When they arrived at the church, they found the priest arranging candles for the evening mass. Seeing the group in a state of despair, he immediately led them to a reserved room in the back of the temple. "What happened?" Father Michael asked, noting the terror in Lily's eyes. Theodore quickly explained the entire situation, from his discovery of Vince's crimes to the violent persecution they had just escaped. The priest listened in silence, his face growing darker and darker. "Vince Drummond," he murmured. "I always suspected there was something wrong with that man. He makes generous donations to the church, but his eyes, they always gave me chills." "Father, we need a safe place to stay until the police resolve the situation," Rose asked. "Of course. There are guest rooms here in the parish house. You can stay as long as you need." At that moment, social worker Sarah Johnson arrived at the church accompanied by 2 detectives from the state police. She had followed the trail of the sirens and discovered that the situation at the shack was related to her emergency call. "Rose! Thank God you're okay!" she exclaimed, hugging the older woman and Lily. The detectives introduced themselves as Detective Silva and Detective Mendez, specialized in financial crimes. They listened attentively to Theodore's account of the discoveries they had made in the corn syrup processing factory. "The evidence you collected is very important," Detective Silva said, examining the photos of the documents. "But we need more to build a solid case against Vince Drummond." "He has contacts in the local police," Mark warned. "That's why we called you from the state." "You did well. We had already been investigating irregularities in Drummond's companies for months. This evidence is exactly what we needed to move forward with the investigation." It was then that Rose made a courageous decision. She took the old photograph out of her pocket and showed it to the detectives. "There's something else you need to know," she said. "This photo was in Vince's personal drawer. It's a photo of me with Theodore when he was a child, after the fire that killed his family." Detective Mendez examined the image carefully. "This suggests that Vince had prior knowledge about the Albuquerque family tragedy. Do you think he may have been involved?" "It's possible," Theodore responded, his voice filled with pain. "I always thought it was strange how he appeared in my life years later, offering partnership just when I was trying to rebuild my life." Lily, who had remained quiet during the adults' conversation, suddenly pulled on Rose's shirt. "Grandma, can I tell them about what the bad man said on the phone?" Everyone turned to the girl, intrigued. "What bad man, honey?" Detective Mendez asked, crouching down to Lily's height. "The leader of the men who broke into our house. He was talking on the phone with someone and said that his boss knew your Theodore since he was little, and that now he was going to finish what he started years ago." Lily's words made a heavy silence fill the room. If Vince really knew Theodore since childhood and had said he was going to finish what he started, it suggested that the fire hadn't been accidental. "My God," Theodore whispered. "He killed my family." "Calm down," Detective Silva said. "These are strong indications, but we need concrete evidence. The testimony of a 4-year-old may not be enough in court." Father Michael, who had listened to the entire conversation, spoke up. "Perhaps I can help. I have access to the old parish archives. If Vince was involved with the Albuquerque family in the past, there may be records of baptisms, marriages, or other events that establish a connection. That would be very helpful, Detective Mendez agreed. While they discussed strategies, on the other side of town, Vince was in his office, having a tense conversation on the phone. "How did they escape?" he shouted. "It was an old woman, a child, and two unarmed men. Boss, the police arrived too quickly. Someone must have called," Carl explained from the other end of the line. "That means they have official protection now. The situation has become much more complicated." Vince hung up the phone and walked to his window, watching the city lights. His options were running out quickly. Theodore had discovered his crimes, had compromising evidence, and now had police protection. But Vince hadn't gotten where he was by being easily defeated. He picked up another phone and dialed a familiar number. "Detective Riley, it's Vince. I need you to do me one last very important favor." Back at the church, the detectives were organizing a protection plan for Theodore and his new makeshift family. Rose had insisted that Lily was her responsibility, and Theodore felt equally responsible for the safety of the two women who had risked everything to help him. "We're going to transfer you to a safe location in the state while we build the case against Vince," Detective Mendez explained. "What about the corn syrup processing factory workers?" Theodore asked. "If Vince executes his fraudulent bankruptcy plan, thousands of families will be without livelihoods." "That's why we need to act quickly," Detective Silva replied. "But with the evidence you collected, I believe we can get a warrant to freeze the company's assets." Lily approached Theodore and took his hand. "Theodore, after they arrest the bad man, are you going to leave?" The innocent question deeply touched Theodore's heart. He looked at that brave little girl who had changed his life, and then at Rose, the woman who had saved him twice in crucial moments. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "You are my family now." But as they made plans for the future, none of them knew that Vince had activated one last desperate resource, a resource that would put them all in even greater danger than they had faced until then. The early morning brought a deceptive calm to the parish house. Lily slept peacefully between Rose and Theodore in the guest room, finally feeling safe after days of terror. But that peace would be violently interrupted. At 5 in the morning, Detective Riley arrived at the church, accompanied by 4 police officers, claiming to have an arrest warrant for Theodore for embezzlement and conspiracy. The document looked official, but had been forged through Vince's corrupt contacts. "Theodore Albright, you're under arrest," the detective announced when Father Michael reluctantly led them to the rooms. "This is absurd," Detective Mendez protested, who had spent the night at the church to ensure the group's safety. "This man is under the protection of the state police." "I'm sorry, but I have local jurisdiction and a valid warrant," Riley retorted, showing the falsified papers. Theodore knew that resisting would only put Rose and Lily in more danger. "It's okay," he said calmly. "I'll go with you." "No!" Lily cried, clinging to Theodore's legs. "They can't take you." The scene of a 4-year-old desperately trying to protect the man she considered family moved even some of the police officers present, but Riley remained inflexible. "Theodore," Rose whispered, approaching him. "This is a setup by Vince. He's using the corrupt police." "I know," he replied quietly. "But if I don't go, he'll find other ways to attack us. At least, this way you'll be safe." Before being taken away, Theodore knelt in front of Lily. "Listen carefully, my little warrior. You need to be brave once again. Take care of Grandma Rose, and I promise I'll come back." "Do you really promise?" she asked through tears. "I promise." As they took Theodore away, Rose felt as if she were reliving the loss of her daughter years ago. Lily cried inconsolably, and not even Father Michael's loving efforts could console her. Detective Mendez immediately contacted her superiors in the state, reporting the wrongful arrest. "We're going to challenge this legally, but it may take a few hours. A few hours may be too long, Rose murmured, knowing the violent reputation of Vince's men. At the police station, Theodore was placed in an isolated cell. Riley had ensured that he was alone, claiming it was for his own protection. In reality, it was to facilitate what Vince planned to do next. At 10 in the morning, Vince appeared at the police station, claiming he wanted to talk to his former partner. Riley allowed him to enter the cell, violating all security protocols. "Finally alone," Vince said with a cruel smile, sitting in the only chair in the cell. "What do you want, Vince?" "I want you to sign some documents transferring your shares of the corn syrup processing factory to me, voluntarily." "Never." Vince laughed. "I figured you'd say that. That's why I brought some incentives." He showed Theodore recent photos of Rose and Lily leaving the church. "Nice pictures, don't you think? Especially the little girl. It would be a shame if something happened to her." The threat against Lily made Theodore's blood boil. "If you lay a finger on them—" "You what? You're in a cell, Theodore. You can't protect anyone from here." Vince stood up and walked to the bars. "But there's a way to ensure they stay safe. Sign the papers, and I'll never bother your new family again. And if I don't sign, well, accidents happen, especially with little kids playing near busy streets." The specific threat against Lily broke Theodore's resistance. He couldn't risk the life of the girl who had become more important to him than his own assets. "Where are the papers?" Vince smiled triumphantly and pulled the documents out of his pocket. "I'm glad you saw reason." Meanwhile, at the church, Rose had made a desperate decision. She knew that official justice was being manipulated by Vince and that she needed to act on her own. "Father Michael," she said, "I need to go to the police station." "Rose, it could be dangerous. Theodore is in danger, and I have something that could change everything." She had kept the old photograph, but now she knew she needed to use it as a weapon. If she could publicly prove that Vince had connections to Theodore's tragic past, perhaps she could expose his true nature. "Grandma, I'm going with you," Lily said with determination. "No, my flower, it's too dangerous." "But your Theodore needs us. And you said friends protect each other." Lily's simple logic touched Rose deeply. The girl was right. They were a family now, and families don't abandon each other. "Okay, but you promise to do exactly what I say?" "I promise." When they arrived at the police station, Rose asked to speak to Theodore, claiming to be his elderly aunt. The officer on duty, who wasn't involved in the corruption, allowed a quick visit. Rose and Lily were led to the cell, where they found Theodore with documents in hand, and Vince watching with satisfaction. "Grandma, you're Theodore!" Lily cried when she saw them. The unexpected presence of the two women caught Vince completely off guard. He hadn't expected them to have the courage to come to the police station. "What are you doing here?" he asked, clearly annoyed. "I came to get my grandson," Rose said firmly, "and I came to show everyone who you really are." She took the photograph out of her pocket and showed it to the police officer who had accompanied them. "This photo was in this man's personal drawer. It's a photo of me with Theodore when he was a child, after the fire that killed his family." The police officer examined the image, intrigued. "And what does that mean?" "It means that he knew Theodore since he was a child. It means that he knew about the family tragedy and even so approached him years later pretending to be his friend." Vince tried to grab the photograph, but Rose was faster. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. "It proves you're a liar," Lily retorted with the brutal honesty of children. "And men who lie about important things are bad men." At that moment, Detective Mendez and Detective Silva arrived at the police station with a court order from the state to release Theodore immediately. They had discovered that the arrest warrant was false. "Detective Riley," Detective Mendez said, "you're under arrest for forgery and corruption." The situation had completely reversed. Vince, realizing that his last resort had failed, tried to leave the police station but was stopped by the detectives. "Vince Drummond, you're under arrest for corporate fraud, threats, corruption of public officials, and suspicion of homicide." Detective Silver announced. As the handcuffs were placed on Vince, he looked directly at Theodore with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his words rang hollow. Finally, after years of crimes and manipulations, Vince Drummond had been defeated by an unlikely family formed by a wounded businessman, a courageous grandmother, and a 4-year-old girl who refused to let evil win. Theodore embraced Rose and Lily, feeling for the first time in decades that he had a real family. But there was still one final revelation that would forever change how they saw their shared history. A week after Vince's arrest, the life of Theodore, Rose, and Lily had gained a new and comforting routine. They were temporarily staying in a small hotel in downtown Trenton, while Theodore dealt with the legal issues to fully regain control of his companies. Lily had quickly adapted to the new reality, especially after Theodore promised that they would build a new house for the three of them to live together. The girl spent her days drawing blueprints of the future house, always including a large room for her and another for Grandma Rose. "Theodore," she said one morning while they were having breakfast at the hotel, "when our house is ready, can I have a yard to play in?" "Of course. A big yard with fruit trees and colorful flowers. And can I plant a garden to help Grandma?" Rose smiled, watching how her granddaughter had become even more determined and confident after everything they had been through. The traumatic experience had, paradoxically, strengthened the girl's already courageous character. That afternoon, they received an unexpected visit at the hotel. It was Father Michael, accompanied by an elderly woman that Theodore did not recognize. "Theodore," the priest said with a serious expression, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Eulalia Santos. She has important information about your family." The woman, approximately 80 years old, observed Theodore with eyes that seemed to carry decades of secrets. "You've grown a lot," she said softly, "but you still have the same eyes as when you were a boy." "I'm sorry, but I don't remember you," Theodore replied politely. "That was expected. You were very shaken up at the time. My name is Eulalia Santos, and I was the head nurse at St. Rita's Clinic when you were admitted after the fire." Rose leaned forward, intrigued. "Mrs. Santos was my supervisor at the clinic, one of the best nurses I've ever known. And that's why I came," Eulalia said, taking an old folder out of her purse. 22 years ago, I kept some documents that at the time I thought might be important. Documents about the fire at Hope Farm." Theodore felt his heart race. "What kind of documents?" "Medical reports, testimonies from the time, and mainly a conversation I overheard between two men at the hospital on the night you arrived." Eulalia opened the folder and took out several sheets yellowed by time. "At the time, 2 men came to the hospital asking about you. One was a lawyer who claimed to represent distant relatives. The other was very young, but there was something sinister about him. Do you remember their names?" "The lawyer was Dr. Pereira. The young man introduced himself as Vince Drummond." The name hit Theodore like lightning. "Vince was at the hospital when I was a child. Not only was he there, he tried to convince Dr. Pereira to declare you mentally incompetent due to the trauma. They wanted you to be admitted to a psychiatric asylum." Rose covered her mouth with her hands, horrified. "Why would they do that?" "From what I heard from their conversation, Vince claimed that you were an orphan from a wealthy family, and that, as a traumatized minor, you needed guardianship. He was trying to become your legal guardian." "To get the inheritance," Theodore murmured, finally understanding the extent of Vince's manipulation. "Exactly. But Dr. Pereira refused to cooperate. He said that you were mentally sound and that you would be better raised by genuine close relatives." Eulalia continued flipping through the documents. "That's when your real uncles from out of state appeared. They took you away from here and Vince was furious." "Wait," Theodore said, a vague memory surfacing in his mind. "I remember hearing arguments in the hospital. Men arguing about who would stay with me." "Yes. Vince tried in every way to prevent your legitimate uncles from taking you. He even claimed that they didn't have the financial means to care for a traumatized child. Lily, who was listening to everything in silence, suddenly asked a question that surprised the adults. So the bad man already wanted to hurt Theodore since he was little like me? Unfortunately, yes, my dear, Eulalia replied. That man has always been driven by greed. Father Michael spoke up. Mrs. Santos, is there anything else we should know? The retired nurse hesitated, clearly struggling with some heavy secret. Yes, there is. Something I've never told anyone, but that might explain why Vince was so determined to control Theodore. She took a different document from the folder, more formal than the others. This is the original will of Theodore's father, which arrived at the hospital along with the family's belongings. Theodore took the paper with trembling hands. It really was his father's will, dated just 2 months before the fire. Read the clause about inheritance, Eulalia indicated. Theodore read aloud, In the event of my premature passing, all the assets of Hope Farm, including land, buildings and investments, shall be transferred entirely to my son Theodore Albright when he turns 21 years old. Until then, the assets will be under the administration of the Bank of America, and no individual shall have access or control over them. My God, Rose whispered. Vince knew he couldn't just steal the inheritance. He needed legal control over Theodore. Exactly, Eulalia confirmed, and when he couldn't become Theodore's guardian as a child, he waited. He waited decades, built his own fortune through questionable methods, and then approached Theodore as an adult, as a partner, to have legal access to the inheritance assets. Theodore was in shock. Does this mean that everything, our partnership, the corn syrup processing factories, everything was planned from the beginning? Everything. Vince is a calculating psychopath. He planned for over 20 years how to get what he always thought should be his. But why did he think he was entitled to the inheritance? Rose asked. Eulalia took the last document from the folder. It was a yellowed birth certificate. Because Vince Drummond is a distant cousin of Theodore, son of a sister of the paternal grandfather who was disinherited by the family decades ago. The final revelation left everyone in silence. Vince was not just an opportunistic criminal. He was a relative who believed he had been wronged and who had spent his entire life planning his revenge. He always believed he deserved part of the family inheritance, Eulalia continued. And when his parents disinherited his lineage, Vince decided that he would take everything by force. Lily, with her childish logic, summarized the situation in a surprisingly clear way. So, he's like the bad kids who break other kids' toys when they can't play with them. Exactly like that, my dear, Theodore replied, hugging the girl. But now he'll never be able to hurt anyone again. Father Michael blessed the makeshift family that had overcome decades of manipulation and revenge. You have proven that love and courage are stronger than evil and greed. That night, while Lily slept peacefully between Theodore and Rose, the two adults talked about the future. Theodore, Rose said softly, are you sure you want to build a family with us? You're a wealthy man. You can have any life you want. Rose, you saved me twice, first when I was a child and then through the courage of your granddaughter. You are the family I chose, and that chose me too. And the orphanage you wanted to build in memory of your sister, Theodore smiled. We'll build it together. It will be a place where children like Lily and Carla can find love and protection. It was the beginning of a new life for all of them, built on the ruins of a painful past, but illuminated by the hope of a future full of love and purpose. 3 months had passed since Vince's arrest, and life had taken a completely different turn for Theodore, Rose, and Lily. The new house was almost ready, a cozy construction on the outskirts of Trenton with the big yard that Lily had dreamed of, and a flower garden that Rose took care of with affection. But not everything had been easy. The legal process to fully recover Theodore's assets and dismantle Vince's fraudulent schemes had revealed a network of corruption much more extensive than they imagined. Hundreds of small rural producers had been harmed by illegal loans, and Theodore had decided to use part of his recovered fortune to compensate them. "Theodore," Lily said one Saturday morning, while helping Rose prepare breakfast in the new kitchen, "when are we going to visit Carla at the shelter?" The girl's question touched a wound that still hurt in everyone's heart. Carla, neighbor, the girl next door who had been removed from the violent home, was in a temporary shelter while the social assistance system looked for a suitable adoptive family. Lily insisted on visiting her regularly and had developed a plan that she had shared with Theodore and Rose the week before. "We're going this afternoon," Rose replied, stroking her granddaughter's hair. "You can take those drawing books we bought for her. And can I ask her if she wants to live with us?" The question made Theodore and Rose exchange a meaningful look. They had talked about the possibility of adopting Carla, especially because Lily had developed a deep connection with the girl, but the adoption process was complex, and they were still settling in as a family. "Lily," Theodore said carefully, "adopting a child is something very serious. We need to be sure that we can give her everything she needs. But we can. We have a big house, good food, and lots of love. And Carla is already my sister at heart." Lily's simplicity and generosity continued to impress the adults. At 5 years old, she had celebrated her birthday the previous month. She demonstrated an emotional maturity and a capacity for love that contrasted with the trauma she had experienced. That afternoon, when they visited Carla at the shelter, they found the girl thinner and quieter than they expected. She hugged Lily with a desperate force, as if she wanted to make sure that her friend was real. "Hi, Carla," Lily said cheerfully. "I brought new books for you, and Grandma Rose made cookies." Carla smiled shyly, but her eyes revealed a deep sadness. "Lily, are you going to leave again?" "I'm not. And you know what? I talked to your Theodore and Grandma, and they want you to come live with us forever." Lily's words made Carla start to cry, not out of sadness, but out of a hope so intense that it hurt. "Is it true?" Theodore approached and knelt down to the two girls' height. "Carla, I would really like you to be part of our family, but it's an important decision, and you need to be sure that this is what you want." "I want to," she said immediately. "I really want to." Rose hugged the two girls, feeling her heart expand to include one more child who needed love and protection. "Then let's talk to the social worker and start the process." 2 weeks later, they received news that would change their plans. Vince had escaped from prison during a transfer. The news came through an urgent phone call from Detective Mendez, who alerted them to increase security. "How is this possible?" Theodore asked, feeling the familiar fear return. "There was an ambush during transport. 2 guards were injured, and Vince simply disappeared. We believe he had accomplices on the outside who planned the escape." The news devastated Lily, who had finally begun to feel completely safe. "Is he going to come back to hurt us?" she asked in a small voice. "We're not going to let that happen," Theodore promised. But internally he was terrified. Vince, at large, was a deadly threat to all of them. They were forced to move temporarily to a safe location, a house in a small town 2 hours from Trenton, where they would be under police protection until Vince was recaptured. Carla, who had just been officially adopted by the family, was confused and scared by the sudden move. "Why do we have to hide?" she asked Lily. "Because there's a very bad man who wants to hurt our family," Lily explained, with the honesty she had learned to value. "But we're not going to let him get away with it." For 3 weeks, they lived in relative isolation, with police officers making constant rounds around the house. Theodore tried to maintain normal activities for the girls, tutoring in the morning, playing in the fenced yard, movies at night, but everyone felt the constant tension. It was on a Thursday night that Vince finally appeared. Rose was putting the girls to sleep when she heard a strange noise coming from the backyard. Theodore was in his makeshift office, reviewing legal documents, when all the lights in the house went out simultaneously. "Theodore!" Rose called in an urgent whisper. He ran to the girls' room, where he found Rose hugging Lily and Carla, neighbor, who had woken up scared by the sudden darkness. "The streetlights are out too," Theodore observed, looking out the window. "This isn't a normal power outage." At that moment, a familiar voice echoed from the backyard. "Theodore! I know you're in there. The time to hide is over." It was Vince. He had found the hideout and apparently neutralized the police protection. "Daddy Theodore," Carla whispered. She had started calling him that spontaneously. "I'm scared." "Me too," Lily admitted, "but we'll stay together. Family protects family." Theodore felt a mixture of pride and terror at hearing the courage of his adopted daughters. They had learned to face fear, but they shouldn't have to. "Rose," he whispered, "take the girls to the back room. There's an emergency exit we installed." "And you?" "I'm going to face Vince. It's time to end this once and for all." "No!" Lily protested. "We're not going to leave you alone." "You're not going to leave me alone," Theodore replied, embracing the three women in his life. "You're going to be safe, and that's what will give me the strength to face him." Outside, Vince continued shouting threats, his voice filled with a fury accumulated during months of imprisonment and humiliation. He had lost everything: companies, money, status, freedom, and wanted to make Theodore pay for every loss. But inside the house, a family united by love and courage prepared for the final confrontation that would determine whether goodness could definitively overcome the evil that had been pursuing them for so long. Theodore guided Rose and the two girls through the dark hallway to the back room, where there was a door that led directly to a wooded area behind the house. His hand trembled slightly as he unlocked the security lock they had installed as a precaution. "Listen carefully," he whispered, kneeling down to Lily and Carla's height. "You're going to go out here with Grandma Rose and run to the house of Mrs. Mercedes, our neighbor. She has already been instructed on what to do in case of emergency." "Daddy Theodore," Carla said, holding his hand firmly, "what if the bad man hurts you?" "That's not going to happen," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Because you gave me something he never had, a real family worth protecting." Outside, Vince had stopped yelling, and the house was enveloped in a menacing silence. Theodore knew that this meant that the man was approaching the house, probably looking for a way to get in. "Grandma," Lily said suddenly, pulling on Rose's shirt, "what if we don't run away?" "What do you mean, honey?" "What if we stay and help Daddy Theodore? We're a family, aren't we?" "Families face problems together." The suggestion of a 5-year-old to face a dangerous man would seem absurd under normal circumstances, but Rose recognized something in her granddaughter's voice that made her hesitate. It was the same courageous determination that had led Lily to open the door to a wounded stranger months ago. "Lily is right," Carla said surprisingly. "In the house where I lived before, my mum always stayed alone to face my dad when he drank, and she always got hurt. But when we stayed together, he was more scared." Theodore looked at those three women, a 73-year-old woman and 2 little girls, and realized that they were right. Vince was driven by cowardice and the sense of power over the vulnerable. Facing a united family might be exactly what he didn't expect. "Okay," he said finally, "but we do this my way. Rose, you and the girls stay here in the room, with the exit door open in case we need to flee quickly. I'm going to talk to Vince, and you only intervene if I give the signal." At that moment, they heard the sound of glass breaking in the front room. Vince had forced his way in. "Theodore!" he shouted from inside the house. "Stop hiding like a coward! Come face what you owe me!" Theodore took a deep breath and left the room, walking slowly through the dark hallway towards the living room. When he arrived there, he found Vince standing in the middle of the living room, illuminated only by the moonlight that entered through the broken window. The man seemed to have aged years during the months of imprisonment. He was thinner, his hair disheveled, and there was an instability in his eyes that didn't exist before. "Finally," Vince said with a disturbed smile. "I thought I was going to spend the whole night playing hide and seek. What do you want, Vince? What I always wanted, what was always mine by right, your fortune, your companies, your comfortable life built on the ashes of my family. Your family wasn't burned in that fire, Theodore said calmly. Your family was disinherited decades before for choices they made. Lies, Vince shouted. My grandfather was wronged. And when I couldn't fix it by becoming your guardian when you were a child, I decided to wait. I waited over 20 years to have the chance to take what is mine. And now, even if you kill me, you'll never get the inheritance. The documents prove that you're a criminal. Vince laughed bitterly. I don't want the inheritance anymore, Theodore. I want something much more satisfying. I want you to lose everything you love, just like I lost. It was then that he took a knife from his jacket, and Theodore understood that Vince had completely lost his sanity. He was no longer interested in winning, he just wanted to destroy. Where are they? Vince asked, advancing slowly. The old woman who protected you and the children you pretended to love? Far from you, Theodore replied, retreating but keeping himself between Vince and the hallway that led to the back room. They can't be too far. This house isn't that big. Vince began to move towards the hallway, but Theodore blocked his path. You'll have to go through me first. With pleasure. Vince attacked with the knife, but Theodore managed to deflect it and grab his wrist. The two men fought in the dark, knocking over furniture and breaking objects. It was during this fight that Lily made a decision that would make everyone proud and terrified at the same time. She quietly left the room, went through the kitchen, and went out the back door. Instead of running to get help, she went around the house and entered through the broken window of the living room, positioning herself behind Vince while he fought with Theodore. "Hey, bad man!" she shouted suddenly. Vince turned around, surprised, releasing Theodore for a moment. "The brave little girl came to see me." "Yes, I did. And I brought something for you." Lily was holding Theodore's cell phone, which she had taken from the kitchen table, and she was recording everything. "What a clever little girl," Vince said sarcastically. "Do you think a recording is going to stop me?" "No," Lily replied with surprising calm. "But I think this will." She pointed to the window, where several flashlights were approaching the house. The recording wasn't for evidence, it was for location. The phone had automatically sent an emergency signal when she activated the recording function. Vince realized that he had been tricked by a 5-year-old child, and his fury exploded. He turned to attack Lily, but Theodore threw himself between them, receiving the stab that was intended for the girl. At that moment, police officers stormed the house, immobilizing Vince before he could attack again. "Daddy!" Lily cried, running to Theodore, who was on the floor holding the wound on his arm. Rose and Carla arrived running, and the family gathered around Theodore, who smiled despite the pain. "I'm okay," he said. "It'll take more than a stab to separate me from you." 6 months later, they were gathered in the garden of their permanent home, not the safe house, but the home they had planned together. Vince was serving a 30-year sentence in a maximum security prison, and finally their lives could go on in peace. The orphanage in memory of Theodore's sister had been completed and already housed 15 children who, like Lily and Carla, had found love and protection where before there was only pain. "Daddy Theodore," Carla said, now 7 years old and completely integrated into the family, "can I plant tulips in the orphanage garden?" "Of course you can," he replied, watching Lily teach other children to draw colorful birds in the yard. Rose approached him on the porch, bringing a glass of fresh lemonade. "Can you believe it all started with you wounded at our door?" "It didn't start there," Theodore corrected, putting his arm around her. "It started 22 years ago when a young nurse saved the life of a traumatized boy. Fate just gave us time to grow before bringing us together again." Lily ran up to them, holding a new drawing. It was the complete family, Theodore, Rose, her, and Carla. But this time there were dozens of other children around, all smiling, all protected. "Look," she said proudly, "our big family." And it really was. What had started with a brave girl helping a wounded stranger had turned into a network of love and protection that touched dozens of lives. Theodore looked at the drawing and then at the radiant face of his daughter. "Lily, you know you saved me, don't you?" "I know," she replied with a smile, "but you saved me too, and Grandma saved us all." That's how it works in a real family. As the sun set over Trenton, 4 people that fate had united in an extraordinary way celebrated not only their victory over evil, but the discovery that true love can flourish in the most unexpected places and overcome the most impossible obstacles. The story that had begun with cries of pain had turned into a symphony of hope, proving that even in the darkest moments, there is always a light waiting to be discovered by those courageous enough to look for it. If you liked this wonderful story, please comment. Your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.